No, we won't.
Start yelling.
No, let's not start yelling, because the recording has started. So we're gonna get going back on our stylized / low polygon kind of city scene. I just before class started, I added in a light, and the kind of light that I added in is called an infinite light. So if I solo it, it is just basically a light that kind of sits at the origin. You can find it under light and then infinite light. And what's cool about the infinite light is when you add area shadows onto it, if I unsolo, it kind of makes a cool, depending on the angle that you rotate the sun at, I'm going to kind of do like a high angle. It obviously this looks a little bit boring because everything is just plain white, but once we start adding in some color and some extra objects and stuff, the lighting is pretty cool looking, and it's a pretty useful style to learn and get good at. So I'll just turn that off for a little bit because we're going to focus on making some more objects. So I'm going to make a second building, and in order to start that, I'm just going to turn everything else off just so that I can have a clean starting point. So again, I'm going to start with a cube, pretty simple stuff. In this building, I'm going to try to make it a bit different looking. Ideally, my goal would be to make probably 3 or 4 variations of the building, but just for time's sake, I might only get through 2, but I guess we'll see. Because there's plenty of other stuff to lecture in here, so I know that the city is not relevant to everybody, and I want to be mindful of that. So I'm just going to try to jam through this kind of quickly. Or not. Use the knife tool to add some subdivisions. Select that, bevel that. So that way we've got a couple extra, bless you,
Thank you.
subdivisions. Because the reason I'm going to do this is, actually those aren't very even. Just going to try to make sure that I even up these subdivisions a little bit closer. Still just trying to kind of eyeball this quick, but not trying to make it look like crap. It's not an excuse. Doing something quickly is not an excuse for doing something poorly. So I'm going to select all the faces that would represent where the windows are going to be. So that is all of these kind of along the length of this, and I'm going to extrude them just because I'm going to make the windows a little bit differently on this one, I think. So I'm going to extrude these, but what I'm going to make sure is I uncheck this preserve groups button, and this will allow me to have a polygon, an extruded polygon for each of these selected polygons. And then I'm going to extrude out slightly to kind of create the start of my window frame, and then come in, and then come into the building now like this. And so this will give us a little bit different of a look. So what I want to do real quick is I'm going to make myself a selection by using the grow selection, which was under U. And I'm going to deselect where the windows were going to be because I want to have just the frames. so that way I can apply a different material to them later. So it doesn't look like I'm doing much, but I just deselected all the windows, so that way I've got only the frames. And I'm going to make myself a selection tag, which are the little orange tag. So this is going to be called window frames. And this will be building 2. And then on this roof, I'm just going to add in just a little something different. I don't know, some sort of like tower or like chimney sort of thing on the roof. Just something small, not terribly important, but just a little bit of extra detail. Oops. So with that ring around the top selected, I'm just going to bevel a little bit, just because I have a specific idea on what I want to add. And I changed one setting on my bevel, and that is this mitering setting, because when I leave it at default, you'll see kind of right here in the corner, it's creating this kind of junky, ugly mess. That's actually a 5-sided polygon, so that's no good. It's kind of this weird section right here. So setting the mitering setting to uniform gives us like a nice sharp point, that's what I wanted. And so now I can add in a little bit of kind of like a window ledge, kind of like a handrail, balcony, whatever you want to think of it like. Just a little something to create a little bit of detail on the top of that building. So I'll probably call that building done until it comes to the material stage. So I'm going to just drop that into the cloner, and if we turn the cloner and stuff back on, we'll see that now I've got a second building kind of involved in this mix, which is fun. And we can determine, or we can alter the way that this cloner is how it's picking which buildings to populate. There is this clones setting right here. So if you're doing like the forest example that I showed briefly at the end, briefly at the end of the last lecture, say you've got 4 different trees, maybe one really tall tree and a bunch of like smaller sized trees or whatever, you can change this clones setting from like iterate to random. Random is a good setting because then you have this seed value, which allows you to click through and get different kind of patterns of like which items are being used by this cloner. So it doesn't have a whole lot of kind of an effect right now because I've only got two buildings to work with, but I'll try to make more off camera. Do my best to give this a little bit more variety. But the next thing that I want to do is, without needing to model extra buildings or extra objects, I'm going to do another technique which will alter kind of the sizing or the rotation of these different clones. Now this will be useful for pretty much any method or any sort of object that you're putting into this cloner to get kind of like extra variation for free. What I mean by that is it'll allow stuff to look a little bit less patterned or repetitive, and we can do that by using MoGraph effectors. So there's one which is pretty popular called the random effector, and I think I've probably briefly used this in other lectures, like probably a lot earlier in the semester, but I want to go through how to use these and sort of what they are actually doing. So the effectors list here, which is under MoGraph effector, there's probably this whole long list, and we'll use a few of them today, but basically what they do is they allow you to control or alter certain settings of these. These are called the generators. These green ones, like the cloner, we used motext, so the random effector. Long story short, what it's doing right now, if you go to its parameter tab, is it is randomizing the position of our objects in X, Y, and Z by up to 50 units. And we can see that by going to the effector tab, and under this min-max we see it will basically take the value up to 100% or all the way to minus 100%. And we can make this effect stronger, for example, by entering like 500 into one of these values. Now in the Y value, this means that the buildings will be varied kind of up and down. Now maybe if I was making a city from, I don't know, Doctor Strange or something, I would want floating buildings, but in my case I don't want floating buildings, so I'm going to push the Y value down to 0, so that way all the buildings are on the ground plane. But as we looked kind of a top down, this is, if we check and uncheck, we can see, at least based off of the current values we have, it is sort of shifting some of these buildings around, which is kind of cool. And we can play with these parameters a little bit more. I think I want to increase my Z value a little bit more and shrink the X value a little bit, because at least the way that I've drawn my roads are longer in the Z direction than they are in the X direction. So using this kind of top-down camera, I usually probably wouldn't want buildings to kind of go out into the middle of the road, because we can see here this building is now kind of like out in the middle of the street. So which one was that? Here it is. If this is going to be my little road where I'm going to have cars or maybe pedestrians and stuff, you know, I don't want a building out there. So I'm going to switch this back to some other value. Cool. So that is the position. There is also the scale, which is super handy. Now, to turn on and off these different effects, it's relatively self-explanatory. There are just the different checkboxes for kind of position, scale, and rotate. So in this case, we're going to check on scale, and we can make the buildings randomly taller, sort of, if we want, by increasing their Y scale. Now you'll notice this is causing a little bit of a problem, because if we pay close attention, the buildings that it's shrinking, it is causing them to lift up off the ground. And that is because it's scaling the buildings kind of from their middle points, which is not exactly what we want. So I'm going to uncheck scale, because I will show us how to set that up a little bit differently. But real quick, I want to just go over rotation. So we can rotate kind of the angle that these buildings are on by adding in different rotation values. Now, most buildings are not built kind of crooked like this. When you have such a kind of grid style road system, so I'm not going to use the random effector rotation. I'm also going to build that a slightly different way. So because I'm going to have multiple different effectors, I'm going to start naming these. So this one I'm going to call random position, because in this one I'm only using the position value. In the next one, I will make a random effector. Now, the important part to note is if you have the cloner selected, or you want to make sure you have the cloner selected when you make one of these effectors, because each time we make one of these effectors, which are, you know, again, these random effectors, in this cloner there is an effectors tab, and there's a list here of everything that is currently being plugged into this item. Now it's important that if you made one of these effectors and you're changing like the buttons, let's say, you know, I'm raising up this y position value. Why aren't my buildings, moving up and down? It's because in this cloner, I purposefully, but just to demonstrate, I had deleted, or I made sure that this newly made random effector was not in the list. So what I would do is I would click and drag it down into this list, this sort of gray little panel. So like I said, I'm going to make this one the random scale, and I'm going to build it a little bit differently than the position value one. So on this scale parameter, I'm going to check on the uniform scale button, and what this allows me to do is, instead of giving a value on X, Y, and Z, it allows me to just use a single scale value. And the reason I like this is it's not going to kind of stretch my buildings kind of vertically. If you're going for like a super cartoon style, that might be cool to kind of stretch or squash the buildings. But in my case, that's not exactly what I want. So I'm going to check on this random scale and maybe type in like 0.5. So this way I've got some big buildings and some little buildings. But we're still got the problem where some of them are lifting up off the ground or going down through the ground. And the way that I'm going to combat that is under the effector tab right here, I'm going to change the min and max value, and I'm going to change the minimum value to 0, and that'll solve part of the problem. So now the buildings are no longer hovering up off the ground. But wait a second. I think I made a boo-boo. Sometimes this happens. Once in a while you try to do something and you forget exactly what's going wrong. So we can see that some of the buildings are still scaling through the floor. Now, let's figure out why.
So does it ignore the anchor point of the object?
It is currently.
Did you change the anchor point of the object?
I did not. The anchor points of the objects are, yes. So I think the problem is because I have not changed the anchor points of my buildings. So let's turn the ground off, so that way we can see these buildings. So in my case, if you're using like trees or something else similar, you're probably going to want to follow these steps to make sure the anchor point of whatever your object is centered sort of along its bottom. So I'm going to turn on my enable access tool and my snap tool, and I'm going to pull this down and make sure that I snap it to the bottom of itself. So I need to turn on edge snap in this case. Cool. So that's that. So I made the anchor point of this building sort of along its bottom. Now I need to make sure that it is not floating. And so I'm going to drag and snap it down to the axis there. So I'll hide that building and turn this other building back on. And oopsie daisy. Move its anchor point down. There we go. So hopefully this will all be working now. So we'll turn our roads back on, turn our ground back on, and re-enable the cloner. There we go. Yeah. Oh, wait a second. Sweet. Sick. Sometimes this happens. There we go. Okay, so what I've done is I made sure on the building's cloner I want to make sure, at least in my case, that this fix clone setting is on, and then I can just move the transform of the cloner down. Yes, no, maybe so. Oh boy. What have I done? So at some point, before I'd started doing these effectors, I had added in a transform value to the buildings, which I've now removed. So now they're all sitting flush on the ground. Problem is some of them are still sort of moving out of position. Okay. Alright, good enough. We'll figure out the road intersecting thing later. So I've got some random scale and I've got some random position. I'm going to add in the last sort of trick to kind of change these up a little bit is adding in some random rotation. Now, if you are doing objects that can spin in whatever direction they want, what I mean by that is like maybe trees or boulders or cactuses or whatever weird item you're making. If you want to use the random effector and use the rotation setting, by all means, go hog wild and turn stuff like all over the place. I mean, if it makes sense. But in my case, it does not make sense to use the random effector to rotate stuff because buildings, in my case, I want to make sure that they're all rotating in 90-degree increments. So there's kind of a neat trick to do that, and I'll show how to do that. So it involves another effector. So we want to have our cloner selected, and we want to go down to the effectors, and in this case we're not going to use the random effector, we're going to use the shader effector. So the shader effector is cool. It comes with really weird settings by default, so I'm going to uncheck scale and check on rotation, and in this case I'm going to check on rotation and enter in 90 degrees on my H value, and you saw that all buildings rotated sort of 90 degrees to the side. So you might be thinking, well, Billy, you just rotated all the buildings 90 degrees instead of just some of them. So like the way, well, can't really tell yet, but to make sure, or the last kind of piece to this, to have some buildings rotated and other buildings not rotated, is we want to go to the shading tab and add in right here under the shader, we're going to add in a noise. And we'll see that now, in a weird way, again, that is also not that intuitive, is now some of the buildings are somewhat turned and other buildings, well, actually all of the buildings are somewhat turned. So we're still not quite there. What we have to do is click the little thumbnail to go into this shader, and what we want to do is we want to increase the contrast of this. So it's hard to tell because my buildings are pretty much all symmetrical on each side. So just real quick, I'm going to take those buildings out, and inside of here I'm going to put in a cone, and I'm going to make this cone point sideways. So basically, just to visualize what that shader effector was doing, is it's making some of them point up and some of them point left. So hopefully we now have like kind of a visual of what's going on. So I can make some of my buildings, maybe one side is blue and the other side is red, so they'll kind of look different and whatever. So as you catch different sides of them, you'll see different sides of the building. So just put this back to the way that it was. Cool. So I think the last thing that I want to do as far as the buildings go is I want to make it so that the buildings in the center are bigger, kind of like a downtown sort of effect, whereas the buildings kind of as they get further out get smaller. And the way that we can do that is with this scale value, we can, or with the random effector that is doing scale, we can add in fall off. So just like how sometimes when we're using the lights that have fall off, we can add fall off to the scale. So over on the fall off tab, we want to change it from infinity to, in my case, I'm going to do sphere. And we'll see that this tiny little yellow and red sphere pops up. But as I scale that sphere up, we'll see that, you know, the yellow rings will start to encompass the city, and it's a subtle effect, so I'm going to make sure that I make it a little bit more pronounced. So I'm going to make this scale value a little bit larger. So the buildings that are in the middle here are bigger than the buildings that are on the further outskirts. Now I think what I'm going to do, is I'm going to scale all these buildings slightly down, so that this way I can make sure that this effect is stronger visually. Cool, there we go. So now kind of the buildings that are in the middle are almost like skyscrapers of some sort, and the buildings that are out smaller, or out further, are smaller. Now this will have a lot stronger of an effect as we add more and more buildings into this cloner, but you know, we'll get there when we get there. There's plenty of other stuff to build in the meantime. So I think it would be a good time to save, because I've not saved yet in 26 minutes. So shame on me. I think adding in some of the smaller road elements, like maybe trees or like little bus stops, you know, I could get super into this if I want. I could add, you know, little fire hydrants. I could add in like cars. I'll probably add in a car maybe in another class. So let's get going on the trees. So in this case, I'm just going to make the tree in a new file, just because it'll be a little bit easier to manage kind of all these objects in my hierarchy. So I'm going to make just kind of like a cartoon tree that has like a sort of thin trunk in that sort of cartoon kind of circle style.
Can you make a random tree? Like use the effects to make this, you know, the extra spheres go in different spots?
Yeah, actually that's not too bad of an idea. Tyler's point was, can you use cloners and other effectors to sort of automate what I'm doing right here? And the answer is yes. So let's set that up real quick, because I think that's a good idea. So I'm going to delete those two and take this sphere, duplicate it. So this will be tree leaves main. This will be, so obviously they're not going to look much like leaves, but you know, once we do a little bit of material work and put some color on them and all that, it'll be fun. So I'm just going to do like 5, and I'm going to do a y value of 0. So technically, all right now they are all the same. They're all in the exact same spot. If I zoom in, we can see all of these. They're all kind of like inside right now. If I switch to wireframe mode. So with this cloner, I'll do a random effector. Okay, 200 is too big. So let's try 100 by 100 by 100. Not quite. So that's kind of something. So if I like this, I could, just real quick, make a brown material for my tree trunk, and a green material for my tree leaves. Cool, super sick cartoon tree. It's the greatest tree I've ever made.
So it would be like the same thing with like the size of the leaves, everything too. So
Yeah, so we can do a little bit of scale. Good point. Maybe a little bit too much. So with this random effector, we can always change the seed, and at least in my case, they're kind of acting up now, of course, because I'm doing this live, and everything, nothing ever wants to cooperate when you're doing something live.
So for the when you were putting the buildings down, weren't you putting them on like how were they aligned on that platform?
It's not that they were aligned, it's just that I was very creatively, I was making sure that I was placing them where I wasn't, basically the short answer was it wasn't random, like how I scaled stuff and where I positioned stuff. It was thought out. In terms of like how big a building was in relation to how big the roads were, and then I was tweaking when I was setting up like cloners and other stuff like that. I was being mindful of where I was just being mindful of like what sort of parameters I gave the effectors. Oh boy, nope, that wasn't it. That was it. So I just made a copy of this little setup of trees, and we're going to call this leaves 1, and I'll turn off the little traffic lights, turn off solo, and I'll pick another seed. Now you could just kind of do this by hand. Might be faster, it might not. If you have to do a lot of these trees like this, this is probably a quick way to do this. So I'll just do like maybe 2 more. Okay, good enough. Alright, so I'll just delete all that other stuff. Turn these, oopsie daisy. Turn all these back. So I'm going to make 3 trunks and 3 sets of leaves. And I'm going to group these in a null. So I'm going to call this tree 1 and put leaves 1 and 2 inside of it. In this way, the anchor point of that group is sort of at the bottom. So I'm sort of kind of glossing over some exactly, I'm not saying literally every button I'm hitting, because I think, towards the end of the semester, hopefully we've got our wits about us. So basically the end of this is I've got a tree 1, a tree 2, and a tree 3 group, and each of these groups has a leaf and a trunk in it. So I'm just going to copy these and go to my main project, which is under window and then down at the bottom here. This is my main file. So I'm going to paste these in. Trees. So they're kind of like whatever size. Right now they're a little bit big. If we think of these kind of being placed sort of along kind of the corners of these roads or whatever, maybe in front of some of the buildings, that's a little extreme. Or we could place, maybe we could place the trees kind of on the outskirts of town. That might be kind of cool. So actually, I'm going to go with that idea. I think. So I'm going to make another plane. So I'm going to hide my building cloner temporarily, so that way I can see kind of my ground and stuff. And I'm going to make this extra plane, this temporary plane, sort of about the same size as my main ground plane. And I'm going to add in a lot more subdivisions. So instead of like 20 by 20, I'm going to go like 50 by 50. And I'm going to make it editable. And what I'm going to do here is turn the buildings back on. And just with my spacebar, I'm going to select polygons kind of on the outskirts of town. Maybe some kind of like on the inside or whatever. I'm just going to focus on the ones on the outskirts of town for right now. And I'm going to deselect the roads real quick, because I don't want any trees to spawn in the middle of the roads, because obviously that would be a hazard to drivers in my little fake city. Even though they're not real, I care about them.
You should be president.
I appreciate the sentiment to that joke, but I will turn down the offer. Because even though I feel like I'm unqualified, I don't know.
You're actually more qualified for the president we have.
Am I?
Yes.
I mean, I don't disagree that I'm not less qualified, but I'm interested in your opinion on why I would be more qualified. If you can verbalize it. Just because
All the money you have.
I don't have money. He's got...
Yes.
That's true. I don't harass people on Twitter as much. That's something. No, I rage tweet, just not at people. It's more like at airlines, at Comcast, you know, the usual suspects. Okay, so I've deselected some of the polygons for the roads. So, oopsie daisy. I'm going to go through and pick some of these kind of street corners, because I would just like a couple happy little trees, you know, Bob Ross style. Basically what we're doing here on these orange selected polygons is we're going to set up sort of a parameter, or set up limits, so to speak, of where the trees can be populated. So anywhere that is not selected on this polygon, there won't be trees, or there cannot be trees. So if you are doing kind of like the environment, or you know, maybe like a landscape or a forest or whatever, if you wanted to add in a river, you would do this same exact technique to select the polygons that are not necessarily the river. I guess unless you wanted trees to spawn in the middle of the river, but I think for the same reason that trees would not be in the middle of a road, trees would also not be in the middle of a river. Okay, so I can always edit this later, make it fancy or less fancier. So I'm going to call this tree spawning, or tree spawn. And I don't need it on, actually. Because what I'm going to do is just real quick. With this set of polygons selected, we're going to do that same old selection tag. So go to select, set selection, and we have ourselves this little orange tag, which I'm going to name tree spawning selection. And then now we can turn that off. So from this point, we can put our group of trees into a cloner. So I'm going to save before I do anything right now. Save. If you're following along step by step, you should also save right now. And the reason for that is because we're going to change this mode on the cloner from linear to object. Now I think I did this same sort of mistake / demonstration when I was putting the buildings onto the ground plane. I think I goofed the same way. Because once I change it to object, I have this object slot, and when I drag this polygon, or this mesh, object, whatever you want to call it, down into this object slot, it's going to upset the computer. Because it just tried to put a tree everywhere. There's like a lot of trees here. Way too many. So the key setting to change is this distribution setting, and we don't want it on vertex, we want it on surface. And so now basically what it's giving us is a count of 20. So anywhere on this tree spawning section, which is mostly, kind of on the outskirts of town and a couple on the inside, only where we have the selection tag. Now, if we drag in the selection tag into the selection slot, we are going to restrict the trees from spawning to only be on that area that we selected, which is the outside of town. And I can raise my count from 20, I don't know, I'll get crazy and try 100. Ooh. So there's a whole bunch of trees, but they're all sideways, which is not cool. So what I want to make sure is when I go to the transform tab on the cloner, I want to change one of these rotation values, and I never get it right on the first try. In my case, it is -90 on the P, the pitch rotation. Cool. So we've got some happy trees, and they're just kind of all over the place. Now we can start using our fun collection of tools and effectors. But this is going to get pretty crazy in my objects list pretty quick. So I'm going to start setting up some extra groups. Capitalize that B, so buildings group. So in my buildings group, I'm going to put my buildings cloner in and the necessary effectors into the group. And I'm going to make a trees group. And put my trees cloner and the polygon that they were attached to into the trees group. And put the trees group now into my geometry group to kind of keep this nice and organized. So now I'm free to add in effectors and stuff, maintain a little bit of organization. Now I know it's not the most fun thing to do, but if you keep up with it, as you're going through a project and you're not just pushing it all the way off until the very end, it's easier to keep up with. Because one thing that is absolutely awful is if you're working sort of, at a company or collaborating with other artists, if you open up somebody else's project file and nothing is named, nothing is grouped or categorized or organized, it's just like you opened up a junk drawer and a bomb went off. You don't want to be that person. because, like, I kid you not, people will remember that. You know, in my group chat of some of my friends who, you know, are also motion graphics artists, there are names of people from, like, former people's coworkers and stuff. It's like, oh, I got a Joe file because Joe at some point in time was a really awful organizer of his projects. His name's not Joe, I'm just saying Joe. But yeah, it's like when you open up a project and nothing is named, and your boss or a client or something is like, you know, asking you for some quick change. Well, that quick change is not going to be quick if you have to spend half a day figuring out and, like, renaming and organizing and figuring out, you know, if you jumped in this project file and the client, you know, or your boss or whatever said, re-render this but without the trees. You want to know what you would do if you went into my project file and you needed to turn the trees off? That was one button. You turn off the little traffic lights for the trees group. You know, if it's not hard to find, you know, a specific thing by name or even just visually selecting it, you know, you're going to make other people's lives easier. So I'm not just saying that just, you know, it's not just for yourself, because you never know when you might need to share another file with somebody. And, you know, you're going to make somebody pull their hair out if all of your objects are named cube.1. Because if they figure out you were the person who made cube.1 and all your objects were named that, they're going to remember. And you're going to be Joe from what I just mentioned a minute ago. And you don't want to be Joe.
Well, can you have cube.1 but organized in groups? Because
Well,
if you're just quickly modeling something and then just, okay, next part, okay, well, this is now, you know, this is my car or whatever, and then you put in null car.
I mean, it's better, is that car null better be named, the group it's in better be named car in your example. If the group is also named null.1 and inside of it are a bunch of cube.1s, you're Joe. Anyway, back to adding some effectors to spice up our trees. We don't want to do random position because these trees are pretty much already randomly placed. We do want to do random scale. So that's a little bit much. And the same problem that I ran into at the buildings, where some of the trees are floating and some of them are sinking into the ground, is now plaguing me. So I'm going to make sure that on this minimum setting, I change it from minimum minus 100% to just being normal 100%. Or from 0% minimum to maximum 100%. Sorry, easy to fumble my words. And then on the rotation, on the H rotation, I'm going to add in 360 because this will allow my trees to spin in every which way. So cool. This is working out pretty good. None of the trees are intersecting the buildings. But some of the trees are intersecting themselves because some of them are spawned a little bit too close to each other. So on the tree cloner, what I can do is I can change the seed on the selection tag. So if I just lower it, we'll see that we're going to get a different variety each time, and the trees will be placed differently. So I'm going to try to get an overhead view, and I'll probably turn the buildings off just so that I can see everything with nothing blocking my view. So it might be kind of tedious, but at least in my case, it didn't take too long. Oh, nope, just kidding. Those ones are intersecting. Now you could make the cloner editable and then delete some of these trees if you really, really, really wanted to. But I feel like I might add other things into the cloner, so I don't want to quite do that. Alright, this one's not looking too bad. There's one little intersection, but I'll live with that. Cool. So we got the buildings back on, trees are on. I can add in little cars and other fun stuff when I want to, but I'm just going to get going on the materials briefly. We're coming close to an hour on this recording, so I'm going to try to get through this as quick as I can. So I'm going to call this grass. So the grass I've applied to my ground, and then I'll make a grayish sort of cement color for my roads, and I can go over how to add like road stripes and road markers and stuff. I don't want to do that. I'm going to add it to the roads group. There we go. So those are all colored like so. And then I'm going to make a building. So this is going to be called building 1. And I think in this color channel, I'm going to try, just for fun, I'm going to try to add in a surface brick. Just because I'm feeling crazy. So we're going to see what this looks like applied to one of these buildings. Oopsie daisy. So we're going to apply it to building 1. Sick. So scale. I'm going to think I need to adjust the size of these bricks. Obviously, I could try to make this realistically sized, but that sounds like quite a bit of work. And this is sort of cartoony. It doesn't need to be really, really that realistic. Obviously, put a little bit of effort into this. You could, you know, if you don't want to do a brick, if you're doing something like rocks and you wanted to make like a gravel or like a pebble texture or something like that, you know, feel free to jump onto Google Images and, you know, do it the old school way of loading in an image. But this colors, I'm just going to change it to like a, I don't know, kind of more of like a yellowish. Now, I could always just make a copy of this texture, call it building 1 alt, and on this one I can change this color to maybe a gray and white or some sort of different color, and it'll look like I made 2 different buildings, but really I didn't. So some of these are my sort of brownish color, other ones are gray. Now for the other building in here, I'm just going to do a solid color. So this will be building 2. I'm just going to do sort of like a deep blue. and apply it to that. And then I'm going to make a window frame material. Let's call it window frame. And this will be a sort of brightish white. So the window frames windows. So this is why we want to name stuff, so that even though I made this file, well, because of like Christmas break and stuff, I made this file almost 2 weeks ago. So it's hard to remember, but because I've got stuff diligently named, I can find my window frames and apply those easily. And apply this to the window frames of that building. There. Cool. So then the last one I'll do is I'm just going to make a reflective material for the windows. So you could, do a normal glass, like a transparent material, but the problem, at least I don't want to say problem, but in my case, I want to avoid having to model interior rooms to these buildings, because if I make the windows transparent, you'll be able to see into the building, and then you'll see that there's nothing in the buildings. So I want to save myself that trouble, and I'm just going to make the windows purely reflective and kind of get myself out of that problem before I even get into it. So on the windows, on the window glass pieces, I'm going to add on my reflective glass material. And if you'll notice, oopsie daisy, on this building, I forgot to give myself a selection tag for the windows. So I'm going to do that real quick. Call this window glass. So in one building I modeled all of the pieces separate. In another building I'm kind of just doing it with material tags. Kind of whatever is easier for you, more comfortable, by all means do that. Or if you're not even building, or if you're not even making buildings, ignore whatever the heck I just said. So, okay, we've got some buildings. I need to do something about this brick texture on the roof, but well, I think I'll solve that later, because I want to do a little bit of rendering real quick, because we're at 58 minutes on this lecture. So let me figure out which way my sun is kind of aiming. And that's tree. So if I run a little quick test render, we'll see that this is starting to look kind of like something. Obviously needs a bit of work still, but we're getting there. Probably the most annoying thing, or the part that's taking away kind of the coolness of this, is the fact that all of these materials have the default specular, which is this awful fat specular channel with way too much width. So just real quick, on all these materials, I'm going to lower this specular value. And I'll probably add bump maps and other cool stuff to these, but I might save that for another one. So the angle of the sun is kind of a little harsh. I probably want to raise it up so it's a little bit more overhead so that the shadows aren't necessarily so long. Still needs a bit of work, but I think that's a good place to stop. I'm going to cut the recording because we just crossed an hour. So, yeah. See you next time.